Is Britain a nation of monoglots? Well, the British Council, which promotes English language learning around the world, seems to think so as well. The CBI says that Britain lacks foreign language speakers and this threatens the UK's economy. It says that schools should teach a wider range of languages, with the subject being given the same status as maths and science. English, of course, is the lingua franca of global business, technology, even Hollywood. This means that wherever native English speakers go in the world, if we speak slowly enough and loudly enough, someone is bound to understand us. The same, however, can't be said for Norwegians, Germans or Dutch speakers who all have a reputation of speaking English impeccably. So has this made us lazy? The benefits of language learning are not just economic. Physiological studies have found that speaking two or more languages is a great asset to the cognitive process. But should language learning be a priority in the British education system? Well, to discuss this and the issues surrounding it, I'm pleased to be joined by Dr. Florentina Taylor. She's a lecturer at the Department of Education at the University of York. Also here is Alex Rawlings, who is known as Britain's most multilingual student, a speaker of 11 languages, and he also runs a blog on foreign language learning. Also here is Susan Purcell, who's a fellow of the Chartered Institute of Linguists and has written course books on French and German. And on the line is Robert Philipson. He's written many books, including the book Linguistic Imperialism, and he is a professor at the Copenhagen Business School. Many thanks for joining me. First of all, Alex, you speak 11 languages. What got you into language learning? I mean, what was your motivation initially?
I think it's a complicated combination of different things. Basically, I was an only child and I had to spend long summers in Greece because my mother's from Greece. And basically, to connect with other kids, I had to really go out there and meet other people. And I realised that it was a big barrier that we didn't all speak the same language at the age of sort of 6 or 7. And at that very young age, I think this idea started to develop. Wouldn't it be nice to speak to anyone in the world, regardless of whatever language they speak? And ever since then, I've sort of approached it with a lot of enthusiasm.
But so it was an exposure to a foreign language from quite a young age, which isn't really the case for a lot of British pupils, I would have thought.
Yeah, I think I was very lucky. I knew that foreign languages existed and I had a very strong sense of what their use was. And I was also around other people that had learnt foreign languages, so for me it was always a thing that this is something you can do, this is something you can learn. Okay, now it's my turn. That's the way I approached it.
No, I won't put you on the spot, but can you just list the names of the languages that you do speak?
So, I mean, I've studied a number of languages, including German and Russian. Greek I speak as a second language. French, Dutch, Afrikaans, Catalan, Italian, Hebrew, Yiddish. There's always one or two I miss out.
It sounds like you speak Greek as your second language, and you, I would have imagined, speak other languages better than, say, maybe your 10th or 11th language. Or do you speak them equally as well?
No, of course not. I mean, so the last 4 years I've been studying German and Russian. Those are the languages I've really been concentrating on. So currently my best languages are Greek, German and Russian and English. In the other sort of languages I speak, I have a comfortable sort of intermediate level. I mean, I'd like to get them better, but I haven't had the time yet. But I feel they're there. When I need to use them, I can reactivate them. There's definite variation in the abilities that I have in each of them.
Susan, if we learn a bit of German or French, say at school, can we reactivate that later in life? Let's say it gets pretty rusty. Do you think those kind of fundaments of the language always remain with us?
I think so. I also think that even if you haven't got those rudiments and fundaments, you can start again in later life. And of course, many people do. Many people begin to see the relevance of languages more only later on.
But I guess people think that I'm too old to learn a language and children can pick up languages very quickly. Perhaps when we get to in our 20s, 30s, 40s or older, we think that we can't learn a language.
Well, we might think we can't, but I think I can't use a mobile phone very well. It's just my own personal perception. Children, yes, definitely have got a great advantage about learning. Time during the day is allocated to them, which of course time is a major problem for adults. And the government does recognise this in its new national curriculum. Motivation is key. People start all sorts of things late in life, exercise regime, running marathons, whatever it might be. And languages and learning languages is exactly the same.
Do you think there's an age limit, Florentina, to when we can start learning a language? Do you think that perhaps this move to increase language learning in schools is the right move? Because when we're younger, we're more likely to pick up the language.
I'm not sure that when we're younger we're more likely to pick up the language, certainly not better than an adult. And just to add to what Susan was saying, as an adult we've got advanced cognitive development, which children don't have. I think it's great to get as much exposure as possible, like Alex was saying, starting early, being aware that there are people communicating in other kinds of languages that we won't necessarily understand. So just being confronted with that situation where you don't take for granted being able to just communicate your ideas across. So that exposure is absolutely necessary, and cultural awareness and understanding of how you go about communicating with people who don't speak your language. Whether you can get to a high level of proficiency at a young age, it will depend on the amount of input and exposure and the quality of input. So for that, I suppose just having the exposure at a young age would be a great advantage, and later on continuing to work hard and studying more.
Robert, just turning to you, I mean, I guess a lot of arguments are made for the value of learning a second language, including economic, and we'll touch on that in a minute. But in terms of this idea of cognitive development, I mean, do you think we're born linguists and that anyone can learn a language? We're just a bit too afraid to do so.
I think there's no doubt about the evidence that people who are exposed to languages early in life develop greater cognitive skills and more metacultural awareness, more sensitivity to how languages are built up and all that range of things. And often this is done outside schools rather than in schools if you happen to grow up in that sort of environment. So if the government's point at the moment is that the UK is lagging behind continental European countries, there's no doubt that in many continental European countries, not only are people brought up to be confident in a national language, but also in English and preferably other languages, although this is not always a big success, partly because what you mentioned earlier, I mean, I agree with what the other three speakers have said, but there is a basic problem of sort of public awareness of what's involved here. There was this wonderful witticism that in Margaret Thatcher's government, there were only two ministers who understood any other language, any foreign language. They were considered to be the two you don't really trust because they're suspiciously interested in foreign cultures. And certainly I think that role models, people using languages widely, means that one needs to really think the whole strategy through of why the UK should build on the multilingualism that is already there in immigrant and other regional minority languages in people's backgrounds, which is also suggested, but also attempt to show that it is possible to achieve high levels of competence in more than one language. And in Northern Europe, universities are obliged to do that. And that means it's not just a task for language centres or language departments, it's a task for the whole institution.
But I guess, Robert, it's easy for people growing up in Europe to learn or to focus on English as a global language. But if you grow up in the United Kingdom where English is your native language, what language should you choose? Do you choose German? Do you choose Chinese? I mean, it's a difficult question to make, and I guess it would be difficult for schools to decide which languages to offer.
There was excellent work done about 40 years ago by somebody at the University of York, Eric Hawkins, on language awareness, so that what one could have in primary school would be a course exposing you to a varieties of language, different languages, different forms of language, sign language, as well as spoken languages, in order to make you simply interested in how languages are built up and what they're used for. And it's a missed opportunity, but one could go back to trying to open up for openness to a wide range of languages, including those in the community, meaning people of refugee or migrant origin, as well as languages that are definitely important internationally. Because in your opening words, you said something about English being the global language of business. Quite obviously, many languages are used in business, and that's exactly why other language competencies are needed by British people.
And I guess that's the paradox, Florentina, in that the United Kingdom has huge language diversity. I mean, there's something like nearly 300 languages are spoken in the UK. In my street alone, I hear about 5 languages just walking to the shops. We're surrounded by foreign languages, but we don't speak any of them.
I suppose it's comfortable, isn't it, when you know you can always resort to English, everybody will understand you, everybody will make an effort. So I can see the temptation there not to try very hard, both in the UK and abroad when travelling.
But I guess what that means, though, is that the next generation of, say, the first generation of immigrants, they will speak 2 languages. They'll speak the language of where they've come from. They might have come from Eastern Europe, and there's a big influx of people from Poland, and their children will speak both their the language of their parents and English.
Maybe people who have a heritage language and who currently may be perceived as a bit of a problem in schools. Children with English as an as an additional language tend to be perceived as a bit of a problem rather than a huge asset we can capitalize on. So these children will grow up, will have their own children. These generations will definitely speak several languages. I'm not sure that will necessarily extend to British people who do not learn other languages. And I think this realization that in a few generations these people will be speaking so many languages may be at the root of this push for languages in the UK, which is driven by instrumental reasons, business, CV enhancement and so on, rather than a genuine appreciation for languages and the cognitive benefits that you mentioned, and just becoming a better person by being able to communicate interculturally.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Brendan Cole. We're discussing, should languages be taught at British schools? With me in the studio is Dr. Florentina Taylor. She's a lecturer at the University of York. Alex Rawlings, who is known as Britain's most multilingual student. Susan Purcell, who is a fellow of the Chartered Institute of Linguists. And on the line, Robert Philipson, who is author of the book Linguistic Imperialism and is professor at Copenhagen Business School. It certainly reports of, say, let's take, for example, inner city schools in London, where pupils, they may be children of refugees or so on. They don't speak very good English when they come here, and it's very difficult for teachers to teach them. And that isn't actually seen as an asset, that those foreign languages and pupils with those foreign languages coming into British schools.
Possibly not, but they do learn very quickly. And another advantage, of course, is that the children who are playing with them in the playground and sitting with them in the classroom are getting this exposure that Florentina mentioned to other cultures and to the fact that English is not the be-all and the end-all and the English alphabet and this sort of thing. So it's all very useful experience for everybody around them.
What languages should we choose to learn as a second language, Alex? I mean, the CBI talks about Mandarin as an economic language or a language of business and so on in the future. I mean, did that kind of inform your choices as to what languages you learned? I mean, what criteria should we have?
I think this is the biggest problem, really, for the UK. There isn't an obvious language that we can learn. We have to choose from a number of languages. In my personal experience, the most useful language that I've learned in my life has been German. And that's the language that I've been able to use across Europe with different people in all sorts of different scenarios. And it's often the language I find most people have the highest level in. However, if you look at the statistics, German is not the most popular language in schools in the UK. We seem to see things like Spanish, particularly, maybe because people visit there. I don't think that's something that we should disregard either, because the point is that if you want to learn a language and you want to learn a language successfully, you need to have a connection with the culture. You need to want to engage with the people. And if people are visiting Spain and that inspires the kids to want to learn Spanish at school, that's a fantastic thing.
If you put this in the context of the European Union and the way the British interact with people from the other European member states, then crucially, a language like German or Spanish or French are of decisive importance in showing respect for the kind of people you are partners with in managing the European Union. And one suspects that if the British had greater if government sources, ministers and so on, if they had more idea about what went on in those countries, they might be much more effective in trying to reach consensus on what European Union policies should be evolving. I mean, the debate about the UK having a referendum on opting out looks absolutely idiotic seen from a continental European perspective for a whole variety of reasons. But it's symptomatic of the British insular attitude that they think what they're doing is fine.
So maybe we'd be a bit less insular in the United Kingdom if we were to learn other languages, Florentina.
Yes, definitely, because that exposes one to understanding other cultures as well and becoming aware that there isn't one right way to do things culturally and socially, not necessarily, and that being exposed to all these cultures, you begin to question what you seem to be taking for granted otherwise as being the way to do things, and this would expand one's horizon, definitely.
It also improves your English, doesn't it? I mean, I didn't really know much about grammar until I started studying languages, Latin in particular. I didn't know about the parts of speech. I didn't know how a language kind of sticks itself together. And these are skills actually that a lot of people leave school without having. That in itself is a considerable benefit, I would have thought.
It is, if you regard learning languages is a bit like a jigsaw or a puzzle, I suppose. And I learned all my English grammar via Latin that I did at school. So it's been terribly useful in that respect. But then there's no reason why somebody couldn't teach English grammar as well, so that you would learn English grammar. Of course, English grammar perhaps is a bit more fluid than it's a bit harder to say whether a word is a noun in a sentence or an adjective or an adverb. Learning a language does help in all sorts of attitudes. For example, you might be convinced that to say the word all is an adjective, if you've done other languages, but then you learn Arabic and you find actually it's a noun. So it certainly does make you think, learning another language.
Does it, Alex, does it change your attitude? Does it change your personality when you speak in, say, Afrikaans? Can you be ruder in Afrikaans than you can be, say, in, I don't know, German? I mean, do you find your personality changing, whichever language you're speaking?
You know, that's such a big question, and I mean, the answer is nobody knows. My own personal experience is it's not as connected with the language as people like to think. It's more connected with the culture. And, you know, if I go to America and speak American English, I can be ruder. You know, it's not speaking a different language, it's being in a different cultural environment. What languages does in terms of changing your personality and changing who you are is, as I think we've mentioned, it gives you more options. It gives you a wider world in which to live. By which I mean it exposes you to different experiences that influence you. So, for example, I said German was the most useful language that I've learned. The most influential language I learned was Russian, because it gave me a chance to spend a year in Russia, in a Russian family, completely out of my comfort zone, which I came back from an entirely different person.
Robert, perhaps what should motivate children or young people or anyone to learn a language is this kind of window into culture, this access to a country's literature as well as history. And those kinds of things for, say, people growing up in the United Kingdom would probably point towards languages like German, like Russian, rather than, say, Asian languages, which are a bit more foreign, a bit more alien. What do you think about that?
I agree entirely, and I think that what was just said now about knowledge about grammar, whichever languages it's related to, shows that the policy for schools should link what people know about English or their mother tongue to other languages. In other words, there should be coordinated planning, and the school subject English ought definitely to involve the study of the forms of the language. Etymology. I mean, etymology is fascinating if you look at the origins of words. For instance, I mean, I've lived in Denmark for 40 years, and I learned a lot about English by learning Danish, because there are so many words of Scandinavian origin which have been part of the English language for the last 800 years. So I think that there are all sorts of ways in which educational policy in this area should integrate the study of language, whether it's English or foreign languages, and there should be a duty to make sure that this equips students with knowledge about language form, so that they become interested in where languages are used, how they've developed as they have become to be developed in particular cultures, and have an apparatus. They have an ability to know what's what and to build on that in their learning of other languages.
Robert, you wrote the book Linguistic Imperialism, so I'd like to ask you, I mean, do you think that the sheer scope of English across the world actually undermines local languages?
In most of the places where, say, the British have moved, say, to North America, to Australia, to New Zealand, quite clearly there's been a policy to eliminate local languages, just the same as this was attempted in Scotland and Wales and Ireland, with different degrees of success in each context. But if you look at the modern world, very definitely the idea that you can get by with English everywhere is simply not true. I mean, the number of people who are really fluent in English worldwide may be perhaps a quarter of the world's population. And often it may be a superficial conversational proficiency rather than capacity to, say, negotiate at a very high level in say, European Union contexts. In many ways, the idea that English is all you need in the modern world is what this new report by the House of Lords Committee is very interesting for, because it shows that there is an awareness that by neglecting the learning of other languages, the British have been shooting themselves in the foot, and something needs to be done about it.
To what level, though, Florentina, do you think we should learn these languages? I mean, is a smattering enough if we're not involved in high-level negotiations? Is there a benefit to just speaking a few words? I mean, are these the kinds of things that perhaps we should focus on initially rather than complete and total fluency in a second language?
I think a smattering is a lot better than nothing. A word is better than nothing. Anything is better than not being interested in any other languages or cultures at all. But at the same time, I don't think it's very useful to concentrate on accuracy as much as sometimes we do. And this is something that puts children off languages, a clear emphasis on accuracy in assessment, and they tend to be told off when they make mistakes. On the one hand, we encourage them to take risks and take a chance and pronounce new words. On the other hand, we penalize them when they make mistakes, and I don't think this is very helpful. I think we should encourage people to just, yes, take risks, be happy if they can get themselves understood, they get a message across without necessarily insisting on absolutely perfect pronunciation or grammar.
Alex, does it get easier the more languages you learn, the more you pick up? Do you find that you pick up the additional languages? Say you choose a 12th language, would you find that easier than, say, learning the 5th language?
Absolutely, from my experience. I mean, I don't know whether that's just because as I get older, my cognitive powers get better, but I think also it's because the more languages you learn, the more familiar you become with the format of it. You spend less time doing exercises that don't really help you because of the individual way that you learn. And sort of, in my experience, by the 5th or 6th language, I was completely taking control of my language learning routine, the way I wanted to approach it. I knew what wouldn't be effective, and I knew what would, so it all went in much more quickly and much more efficiently.
So does the approach of, say, an autodidact, which it sounds like you are, do you think that is better than, say, the way a language is taught in a school, or your own personal experience of how it's taught at university? There's
pluses and minuses. I've never got as far with any language that I've taught myself as I did with Russian, which was presented to me in a structured format as a university degree. And Russian is now probably my strongest language, possibly even stronger than my Greek, as a result of having that structure and that format in which to approach it. However, it was a very long and difficult journey to get to that level of Russian in only 4 years, and I think most people wouldn't be prepared to do that. You have to experiment, you have to see what works for you, you have to see what's most efficient, and you have to see what you enjoy.
I mean, Susan, what do you think about the way languages are taught in the United Kingdom, say at educational institutions, whether they be schools or universities? Do you think that, I mean, you've written course books and stuff, which presumably means that somebody's sitting down on their own, trying to learn the basics of the language?
It's very difficult to learn on your own. There's a well-known syndrome, I think, called something like Chapter 4 syndrome, which means that most people give up by Chapter 4. You need motivation. Also, one of the problems about languages, or one of the reasons we learn, is to communicate. And of course, a book or a CD-ROM or whatever cannot communicate back with me. The book might tell me that the answer to what time is 6:30. But if I go out and ask on the street, somebody might say, I'm sorry, I left my watch at home, or, well, I think my watch is a bit fast, or why don't you look at the clock up there? So it's unpredictable what people are going to say. So you do need other people. In fact, a lot of people learn for social reasons.
Absolutely. And I think this is one of the big ironies in that a hobby which should be about connecting with people and about being social can be very isolating, not least of all because so few people do it and so few people understand it. However, what I'm observing at the moment in the online language learning community is an enormous amount of technology that's coming through which is designed to overcome that problem and designed to connect you with other learners, so that, for example, if you're learning through flashcards and you're learning vocabulary through a particular app or a particular site, that app will connect you with somebody else who's learning the same list, and you can learn it together through sort of instant video technology and chats. And this is all very nascent at this stage, but it's very exciting. And I think in 5 years' time, someone starting off learning languages like I did when I was 14 will have a very different experience to what I did.
And that all combines speech and writing. I think that schools are presumably in a much better position to give people good writing skills than communicative ability, because it's so illogical to be communicating in a foreign language with 25 other people with the same mother tongue. So that there are huge difficulties in assuming that communication only means speech. It definitely means knowledge about language. It means knowledge about other cultures. And in that sense, this is very important. I wanted to come back just to the point you mentioned about linguistic imperialism, because I think it's great that the British Council is pointing out that there is a huge challenge for the UK. But on the other hand, the British Council itself rides on the wave of the demand for English worldwide, which to some extent they're also orchestrating, so that more and more of the budget of the British Council, in fact, comes from them teaching English. And they know that multilingualism is very important worldwide, that when English is learnt as a foreign language, it's in addition to the languages that people bring to school or the learning task. But there is this rather Janus-faced activity to do with the promotion of English on the one hand, and at the same time saying, look, we also need to promote other languages. And a lot of those issues can become imperialistic in certain contexts if English is being learned at the expense of other languages, which is what has happened in so many contexts. And it may even be happening to some extent in continental Europe now, because the focus on English as the first foreign language means that other foreign languages are not being learned nearly as much. And this applies to French, German, Russian, and other Slavic languages. So that there are huge challenges, in addition, on the continent of Europe to producing multilinguals when they leave school.
So, Robert, what do you think about when the report from the all-party parliamentary group says that the British economy will suffer and Britain's international reputation will be damaged if it has a low level of language ability? I mean, do you believe that?
I haven't looked at the evidence, and it certainly is a rather surprisingly shockingly high figure that's quoted there. Because it's also true that the British are attracting very large numbers of foreign students to higher education for economic as well as political reasons. And the role of English internationally is extremely important for the British economy. So that in a way, there's a very good study by a Swiss fellow called François Grain on the benefit that Britain acquires through not having to spend a lot of time in school on foreign language learning as compared with the continental European countries. So that I suspect that the economics of all this is much more complex than this particular, at least headline, that the UK is missing out on £6 billion per annum or whatever the figure was. I would be very sceptical about that and want to see it put into a wider context.
Interesting that there's a piece written by Emily Maitlis, who's a BBC presenter, and she speaks several languages herself, Florentina, and she said that she tried learning Chinese and she doesn't see the value in it because all it means is that we'll be able to communicate with factory managers. Better to learn German or some kind of European language that has some kind of connection with your culture. I mean, what do you think of that? Seems to be a real emphasis on learning Chinese for business and economic purposes. We shouldn't really be doing it for the money, should we?
I think this is the danger there. Every time you see languages being mentioned in the news in the UK, it's all about business, all about missing out on the big international market. And when you try to say that to a child who's in a position to decide whether they want to continue with the language at 14 years old, they're not going to care about that. They're going to say, because they've got if they're not exposed to this variety of cultures and languages, they have a very limited view of the use of languages. And we've heard in our research, I don't want to do religion because I don't want to be a vicar, or I don't want to become a translator or a language teacher, so I'm not interested in foreign languages. And some research, very interesting research that I've done with my colleague Emma Marsden from York, we've got a paper coming out in the Modern Language Journal soon, shows a clear difference between 14-year-olds' understanding of the relevance of languages in society and the relevance to their own lives. And when it comes to making a choice whether or not to continue to study that language for GCSE, so when they're 14 years old, it doesn't make a difference if they seem aware the language is important in society. It only made a difference in the project that we did in 3 British schools, whether they felt that language was important to them as a person, to communicate with friends, to watch films, to play computer games or whatever, to travel if they have the opportunity to travel. So I think we do miss out by overemphasizing the business need.
Susan, perhaps we overemphasize the fact that it's taught in schools and that, as Alex was pointing out, technology is changing. You can have language lessons on Skype. You can interact in a whole new way that you couldn't before.
There are so many ways that you can learn a language, and at all levels of your life. And probably we ought to be encouraging more employers to lay on classes for their staff. But let me remind you that just about 10 minutes walk from your offices here is the City Lit. And there you can learn dozens of languages, including Catalan, Cornish, African languages, as well as the more common ones. And it's not just London. That's going on in smaller towns all over the United Kingdom as well.
Alex, do you have any other languages on the horizon that take your fancy that you might want to learn in future, or is 11 enough for you?
Absolutely not. I mean, I'm currently learning Hungarian. That's a very slow but very exciting process. I feel like in the next few years I'll also start to take a more active interest in Asian languages. I feel when I have the opportunity to travel there and that sort of becomes somewhere on my horizon, I'm going to want to start learning Chinese.
For you, there's no limit to how many languages you could potentially learn?
Not yet. We'll see. I mean, I know someone who is 43 and speaks 35 languages to extremely high level. And I can speak to him in Greek and German and Russian and Serbian and things like that. He's a native level in all of these languages.
Do you think that some people just have an aptitude for these things?
Personally, I've never met anyone who really can't learn a language. Normally it's other factors that are holding them back. Maybe it's time, maybe it's motivation, maybe it's need, maybe it's materials. But I think if you tell somebody how they could change their life to accommodate learning a new language as a daily thing that they do for 20 minutes to half an hour a day, I've never met anyone who's done that and failed.
Fascinating stuff. Well, and the number of people I've spoken to have said I'm rubbish at languages, but perhaps they should take a leaf out of your book. Many thanks. That's Alex Rowlings. He's a graduate at Oxford University and known as Britain's most multilingual student. He also runs a blog on foreign language learning. Also here in the studio, Susan Purcell, who's a fellow of the Chartered Institute of Linguists, and Dr. Florentina Taylor, a lecturer at the University of York. On the line, we had Robert Philipson, author of the book Linguistic Imperialism, and is professor at Copenhagen Business School. Thanks very much for joining me, Brendan Cole, on The Voice of Russia in London.
Language they speak, and ever since then I've sort of approached it with a lot of enthusiasm.
But so it was an exposure to a foreign language from quite a young age, which isn't really the case for a lot of British pupils, I would have thought.
Yeah, I think I was very lucky. I knew that foreign languages existed, and I had a very strong sense of what their use was. And I was also around other people that had learnt foreign languages, so for me it was always a thing that this is something you can do, this is something you can learn. Okay, now it's my turn. That's the way I approached it.
No, I won't put you on the spot, but can you just list the names of the languages that you do speak?
So, I mean, I've studied a number of languages, including German and Russian. Greek I speak as a second language. French, Dutch, Afrikaans, Catalan, Italian, Hebrew, Yiddish. There's always one or two I miss out.
It sounds like you speak Greek as your second language, and you, I would have imagined, speak other languages better than, say, maybe your 10th or 11th language. Or do you speak them equally as well?
No, of course not. I mean, so the last 4 years I've been studying German and Russian. Those are the languages I've really been concentrating on. So currently my best language...
To discuss this and the issues surrounding it, I'm pleased to be joined by Dr. Florentina Taylor. She's a lecturer at the Department of Education at the University of York. Also here is Alex Rawlings, who is known as Britain's most multilingual student, a speaker of 11 languages, and he also runs a blog on foreign language learning. Also here is Susan Purcell, who's a fellow of the Chartered Institute of Linguists and has written course books on French and German. And on the line is Robert Philipson. He's written many books, including the book Linguistic Imperialism, and he is a professor at the Copenhagen Business School. Many thanks for joining me. First of all, Alex, you speak 11 languages. What got you into language learning? I mean, what was your motivation initially?
I think it's a complicated combination of different things. Basically, I was an only child and I had to spend long summers in Greece because my mother's from Greece. And basically, to connect with other kids, I had to really go out there and meet other people. And kind of, I realised that it was a big barrier that we didn't all speak the same language at the age of sort of 6 or 7. And at that very young age, I think this idea started to develop. Wouldn't it be nice to speak to anyone in the world, regardless of whatever language?
Is Britain a nation of monoglots? Well, the British Council, which promotes English language learning around the world, seems to think so as well. The CBI says that Britain lacks foreign language speakers, and this threatens the UK's economy. It says that schools should teach a wider range of languages, with the subject being given the same status as maths and science. English, of course, is the lingua franca of global business, technology, even Hollywood. This means that wherever native English speakers go in the world, if we speak slowly enough and loudly enough, someone is bound to understand us. The same, however, can't be said for Norwegians, Germans or Dutch speakers, who all have a reputation of speaking English impeccably. So, has this made us lazy? The benefits of language learning are not just economic. Physiological studies have found that speaking 2 or more languages is a great asset to the cognitive process. But should language learning be a priority in the British education system? Well,
time is a major problem for adults. And the government does recognise this in its new national curriculum. Motivation is key. People start all sorts of things late in life, exercise regime, running marathons, whatever it might be. And languages and learning languages is exactly the same.
Do you think there's an age limit, Florentina, to when we can start learning a language? Do you think that perhaps this move to increase language learning in schools is the right move, because when we're younger, we're more likely to pick up the language?
I'm not sure that when we're younger we're more likely to pick up the language, or certainly not better than an adult. And just to add to what Susan was saying, as an adult, we've got advanced cognitive development, which children don't have. I think it's great to get as much exposure as possible, like Alex was saying, starting early, being aware that there are people communicating in other kinds of languages that we won't necessarily understand. So just being confronted with that situation where you don't take for granted being able to just communicate your ideas across. So that exposure is...
Which is a Greek, German and Russian and English. In the other sort of languages I speak, I have a comfortable sort of intermediate level. I mean, I'd like to get them better, but I haven't had the time yet. But I feel they're there. When I need to use them, I can reactivate them. There's definite variation in the abilities that I have in each of them.
Susan, if we learn a bit of German or French, say at school, can we reactivate that later in life? Let's say it gets pretty rusty. Do you think those kind of fundaments of the language always remain with us?
I think so. I also think that even if you haven't got those rudiments and fundaments, you can start again in later life. And of course, many people do. Many people begin to see the relevance of languages more only later on.
But I guess people think that I'm too old to learn a language, and children can pick up languages very quickly. Perhaps when we get to in our 20s, 30s, 40s or older, we think that we can't learn a language.
Well, we might think we can't, but I think I can't use a mobile phone very well. It's just my own personal perception. Children, yes, definitely have got a great advantage about learning. Time during the day is allocated to them, which of course